the Macchi MC.72. To the world, it is a symbol of triumph and the absolute speed record. But in its time, this airplane was known by another name, the flying guillotine. This is the story of how national pride collided with the laws of physics, how a brilliant design, created for victory, devoured its best pilots, one by one, and how crushing humiliation became the fuel for the most desperate engineering comeback in history. This is the story of how a machine, born from the ashes of two disasters, set an eternal record. But the ultimate paradox is that this absolute triumph turned out to be the most brilliant and the most useless dead end in aviation history. The early 30s. The air of Europe hums, thick with the smell of castor oil, gasoline, and an approaching storm. This was an era intoxicated with speed, an era where the roar of an airplane engine was louder than the speeches of politicians, and national pride was measured in kilometers per hour. And the main arena, the gladiatorial coliseum of this new age, was not on land or sea. It was a narrow stretch of sky over the water. Here, once every 2 years, the best pilots and the most insane machines in the world met in battle for the Schneider Trophy. Formerly, a seaplane competition established by a French philanthropist. The prize, an elegant silver statuette and 1,000 pounds sterling. Mere trifles, because the real prize was far more valuable. It was technological supremacy, the right to look down on the rest of the world. And according to the rules, the country whose pilots won the race 3 times in 5 years would keep the cup forever, etching its name into history for all time. And this turned a sport into a war in which one of the main commanders was Benito Mussolini. For him, the builder of a new Roman Empire, the Schneider Trophy was not just a race. It was an ideological showcase. Every turn of the propeller, every triumphant newspaper headline was meant to prove the superiority of fascist genius to the world. Italian machines had to be the fastest, the most elegant, the most deadly. And then came 1929. Italy, confident in its strength, challenged the British on their own turf. But instead of triumph, disaster, humiliation, a brutal slap in the face in front of the entire world. The British Supermarine S.6B flashed past the finish line, leaving the Italian team to swallow the salty spray of defeat. For Mussolini, this was a personal insult, an insult that could not be tolerated. On that day, the obsession with speed turned into a national fever. Il Duce understood. To win, it wasn't enough to simply be better. They had to make a leap into the impossible. A decision was made in his office. No more compromises, no more half measures. The state treasury was opened. The nation's best minds were given an order that tolerated no dissent: create an absolute weapon. An airplane that would not just win the next cup. No, it had to become a flying embodiment of the fascist will. A machine so perfect and so fast that the very thought of competing with it would seem absurd. The task was set. The resources were allocated. Italy held its breath, not yet knowing that in the pursuit of a silver cup, it would give birth to something far greater and far more tragic. On the drawing boards of engineer Mario Castoldi, the silhouette of a beast was already taking shape, brilliant and ruthless. Its name was the Macchi MC.72. So, the order was given, and in the quiet of the Macchi Design Bureau in Varese, Mario Castoldi's pencil began its dance. This man was not just an engineer, he was a sculptor of speed. His philosophy was simple and merciless. Anything that doesn't make the plane faster is unnecessary. Anything that creates drag is the enemy. And after the humiliation of 1929, his hands were finally untied. The state had given him a blank check. Create. without counting the cost, without regard for the risk. Castoldi understood. For a leap into the impossible, an engine from the future was needed, a power plant that did not yet exist. And he delegated this task to another genius, Fiat's chief engine designer, Tranquillo Zerbi. And Zerbi created a monster. He took not one, but two of his best 12-cylinder racing engines, and he fused them together, back to back, into a single, monolithic block of fury and fire. The result was a monster given the name Fiat AS.6. Just listen to these numbers: 24 cylinders, 50 liters of displacement, 930 kilograms of pure rage, ready to unleash 3,000 horsepower. 48 spark plugs fired in its heart like defibrillator shocks. But this titanic power created a problem capable of destroying any aircraft. Gigantic torque, a force that would seek to simply flip the machine on its axis the moment the pilot touched the throttle. And here, Castoldi and Zerbi made a decision that was ahead of its time. They didn't fight this force. They balanced it. On the nose of their creation appeared two propellers, contra-rotating, one behind the other, spinning in opposite directions. The front one, counterclockwise, the rear, clockwise. A complex reduction gear, a true work of engineering art, canceled out the monstrous torque, converting it into pure, linear thrust. It was a dance of two blades, perfectly balanced and deadly dangerous. But the main enemy of speed remained: overheating. How do you cool such a beast? A standard radiator, exposed to the airflow, would have been the size of a barn door. It would have eaten hundreds of kilometers per hour, turning a record chaser into a clumsy heavyweight. And Castoldi made the most radical, most brilliant, and most terrifying decision of his career. He got rid of the radiator entirely. Instead, he turned the airplane itself into a radiator. Imagine it. The entire surface of the elegant wings and the long torpedo-like floats was one single, gigantic heat exchanger. Beneath the thin skin was a complex web of hundreds of meters of copper-nickel tubing. Through them, a pump circulated 300 liters of a boiling mixture of water and glycol, shedding its heat to the oncoming wind. The scorching skin of this beast was its cooling system. Water ran through the wings. Hot oil ran down the sides of the floats. And the pilot? He sat at the epicenter of this hell. Pipes carrying scalding fluid ran into his open cockpit. He was wedged between a roaring 24-cylinder volcano in front and boiling surfaces on either side. Any leak, even a microscopic one, would turn his seat into a scaffold. Thus, on the drawing board, and then in the workshops of Varese, what was born was not just a seaplane. It was an uncompromising mechanical predator. A low-wing monoplane with a metal fuselage and wooden wings, where every line, every curve, every rivet screamed of one thing: speed. There was no room for comfort, safety, or common sense. Only speed. Absolute, pure, distilled. From blueprints and metal, a scarlet demon was born. And now, it craved the sky. But blueprints don't bleed, and metal doesn't scream in pain. The true test of this scarlet demon awaited it on the mirror-smooth surface of Lake Garda. Here, in Desenzano, was an elite unit whose name sounded like an oath: Reparto Alta Velocità, the high-speed department. Its pilots were not just airmen. They were the gladiators of a new era, chosen to tame the beast or die in its embrace. Theory crashed against the granite of reality. August 2nd, 1931. The first to step into the cramped cockpit was Giovanni Monti. He was one of the best, confident, experienced, fearless. The roar of 24 cylinders shattered the morning silence. The machine tore away from the water, leaving a boiling scar behind it. Seconds of triumph. There it was, the flying symbol of the fascist will, soaring over the lake. And then, a failure. A barely perceptible shudder. The engine, that 24-cylinder heart, coughed. Not smoke. Fire. A backfire. A deadly phenomenon where the fuel mixture detonation blows not out the exhaust, but back into the delicate carburetors. Flames struck the heart of the fuel system. Monty was sitting at the epicenter of a volcano, and the volcano began to erupt. A moment later, the MC-72 was no longer an airplane. It was a torch, drawing a black arc across the blue sky before crashing into the water. Silence, and a column of steam over the lake. Shock, mourning, and an icy order from Rome. Continue. The pressure was unimaginable. The race was only weeks away. September 10th, just a month after Monty's death, Stanislao Bellini took the controls of the second prototype. Perhaps, the engineers thought, the first crash was a fluke, a terrible but isolated mistake. Bellini lifted the machine into the air. The flight was normal. He began to build speed, pushing the throttle further, awakening the full power of the Titanic motor. This time, the enemy was invisible. It wasn't a flash, but a shudder. A demonic rhythm, born deep within the engine, resonated with the structure of the aircraft itself. A vibration that at first just shook the instruments, grew into a hammer that tore the metal apart from the inside. Before the eyes of the stunned observers on the shore, this engineering masterpiece began to disintegrate in midair. First, a piece of the tail broke off. Then a wing folded, as if it were made of cardboard. The plane simply ceased to exist as a whole, becoming a swarm of scarlet debris falling into the indifferent waters of Garda. 2 attempts, 2 flights, 2 deaths. Now the truth was stark and brutal. The Macchi MC.72 was not an airplane. It was a flying guillotine, a technological monster that devoured its pilots. A telegram arrived from Rome, short, like the crack of a whip. Italy was officially withdrawing its entry from the 1931 Schneider Trophy. The news echoed around the world. With no competitors at the starting line, the British supermarine S.6B made its ceremonial, solitary lap over the Solent. The silver statuette, Mussolini's dream, had sailed across the channel for good. For Italy, it was a rout, a humiliation that had cost the lives of the nation's best sons. The entire project, the entire source of national pride, was on the brink of total cancellation. From a symbol of superiority, the Macchi MC.72 had become a mark of shame, a cursed machine that kills. The project was dead. A deafening silence fell over the hangars at Desenzano, broken only by the lapping waves of Lake Garda, the very same lake that had become a grave for 2 of the best pilots. The mark of shame, the cursed machine, the flying guillotine. This is what Castoldi's scarlet demon had become. Any sane government would have put an end to it, written off the millions of liar and the human lives as a tragic mistake. But in the fascist Italy of the 30s, logic gave way to will, and the will of Il Duce did not tolerate defeat. To cancel the project would be to admit that Italian genius had fallen to the British, that there were limits they could not overcome. And so the order from Rome was even more insane than the first. Not forget, but fix, not hide, but win. Thus began the most titanic and unseen battle of this story. A battle not for the cup, which was already gone, but for the very reputation of the nation. A battle of engineers against physics. A new man stood at the center of this war. If Castoldi was a poet of aerodynamics, then Rodolfo Verduzio was its ruthless pathologist. With his team, he literally autopsied the cursed machine's corpse to understand what was killing it. They weren't building a new plane. They were exorcising its demons. And the demons, as it turned out, were in the details. First, they tackled the fire. The engine's back breath that had incinerated Giovanni Monti. 24 cylinders, working at their limit, created a hellish cacophony. Any desynchronization in the ignition turned the carburetors into the mouth of a volcano. For 20 months, Fiat's engineers worked their magic on the ignition and fuel systems, adjusting timing, changing magnetos, rerouting fuel lines. They were teaching the monster to breathe correctly, deeply, rhythmically, without a fiery burp. Then they tackled the vibration, the demonic shudder that tore Stanislao Bellini's plane apart. It was a song of destruction, born in the depths of the 24-cylinder heart and resonating with the structure. The Macchi engineers methodically reinforced the airframe. They added new layers of skin to the wooden wings. They welded additional steel braces into the fuselage frame. This engineering masterpiece, born light and elegant, was literally wrapped in a structural corset so it could withstand the fury of its own engine. But the main secret to its revival lay not in metal, but in chemistry. Standard fuel was not suitable for such a high-strung beast. It detonated, burned unevenly, behaved unpredictably. An elixir was needed, an alchemical cocktail that could unleash the engine's full power without blowing it up. And they created it. Just listen to this recipe. 55% aviation gasoline for energy, 23% benzol to increase the octane rating and fight detonation, 22% ethyl alcohol for internal cylinder cooling, and a pinch of poison, a drop of tetraethyllead. This was not just a fuel mixture. It was a custom-designed blood for a mechanical deity. Day after day, week after week, month after month. For 20 long months, this war raged in the roar of test stands and the quiet of drawing rooms. The goal had changed. The Schneider Trophy was lost forever, a symbol of humiliation. But from the ashes of the old dream, a new, even bolder one was born. Forget the race. Forget the competitors. Their goal was no longer to beat another team. Their goal was the absolute, pure, distilled, unlimited speed. To set a world record that would shake the planet. To prove not just superiority over England, but the superiority of man over the laws of nature. A familiar scarlet silhouette was rolled out of the hangar onto the shore of Lake Garda. But this was a different plane. The same on the outside, but reborn on the inside. Tempered, strengthened, with a tamed heart and new, fiery blood in its veins. From the ashes of two disasters, it wasn't just a repaired plane that arose. It was its ideal, hard-won twin. Ready not for a competition, but for a rendezvous with eternity. Now this new demon needed a new pilot, a man willing to sit in its cockpit and push the throttle to the stop. Who would dare to sit in the seat that had already become a deathbed for two? Who would willingly buckle themselves into a scarlet sarcophagus whose reputation was written in blood on the waters of Garda? His name was Francesco Agello, a test pilot whose face seemed carved from the same granite as the alpine peaks surrounding the lake. He looked at this engineering masterpiece, resurrected from the ashes, not with fear, but with the cold calculation of a surgeon. He knew that the ghosts of Giovanni Monti and Stanislao Bellini were still here, in the roar of the engine, in the trembling of the wings. But Agello had not come to avenge them. He had come to finish their work. April 10th, 1933. The dawn over Desenzano was as tense as a drawn bowstring. Silence. All of Italy, holding its breath, was waiting. Agello climbed into the cockpit of MM-177, the very one, the restored one, the machine that had once become a fiery coffin. This was not just a flight. It was a ritual of exorcism. The cockpit of the MC-72 is not a place for a human being. It is a torture chamber. Agello was literally caught in a vice. His back touched the firewall, behind which beat a 24-cylinder heart. Around him, snaking around his seat, was a web of pipes. Some carried boiling water from the cooling system. Others, oil heated to hundreds of degrees. Any leak, however small, would turn the pilot into a victim, boiled alive. He wasn't sitting in the plane. He was integrated into it, becoming another vulnerable component in this infernal machine. A jolt, a roar. The alchemical blood rushed into the cylinders, and the heart spewed not a rumble, but controlled fury. The plane shot forward, struggling to break its floats free from the clinging water. The task was crystal clear and almost impossible: to fly a 3-kilometer measured course at an altitude of no more than 50 meters, 4 times, 2 in one direction, 2 in the other, to cancel out the effect of the wind. The record would be the average. Here it was, the first pass. The earth and water blurred into a green-blue streak. Agello wasn't flying. He was hurtling along, pressed to the surface of the lake like a flat stone skipped by the gods. His body was crushed into the seat with inhuman force. The vibration, tamed but not completely defeated, turned the instrument panel into a shimmering haze. He flew the machine not by instruments, but by instinct, by a feel for the metal, a turn, and another dash in the opposite direction. Second pass, third. Each time he pushed the throttle a little further, feeling for the limit beyond which the steel might say no again. The air roared in protest, compressing before the scarlet wings. Fourth pass, the last one. All the power, all the hatred and genius invested in this plane was unleashed. On the shore, the timekeepers froze, their fingers poised over their stopwatches. The scarlet meteor shot through the measured course and soared into the sky, its roar fading, replaced by the deafening silence of anticipation. And then, the numbers. Dry, dispassionate numbers that, at that moment, were more important to Italy than any poem. 682. 682 kilometers per hour. A world record. Absolute. The shame had been washed away. The humiliation of the Schneider Trophy had evaporated in the superheated exhaust of the AS.6 engine. 2 deaths, 20 months of titanic labor, millions of lyre. It all now had meaning. The Macchi MC.72 was no longer a flying guillotine. It had become a symbol of national rebirth, a monument to a stubbornness that proved stronger than death and the laws of physics. On that day, Francesco Agello flew over Lake Garda, not in an airplane. He was flying on Italian pride itself, and that pride had a speed, 682 kilometers of glory. Glory is a drug, and the dose proved too small. 682. For all of Italy, a triumph. For the team at Desenzano, just a way station. While the newspapers trumpeted the nation's genius and Mussolini reviewed parades, the engineers at Lake Garda looked at their slide rules and saw not victory. They saw a shortfall, because in their minds, a new heretical number was already pulsing. 700 kilometers per hour. This wasn't just the next step. It was a psychological Everest, the sound barrier of its time. A number that seemed impossible, almost indecent for a propeller-driven plane. But for the men who had just resurrected a project from the ashes, nothing was impossible. There was only insufficient funding and not enough time. And the next 18 months became a new descent into engineering hell. This time, they weren't working with a restored airframe. For the assault on the 700 kph barrier, the last and most perfect of the 5 planes built was prepared. MM-181. It wasn't patched up. It was created from the start for one single flight at the very edge of material existence. And if the previous work was an exorcism, the new work was a deal with the devil. The Fiat engineers once again bent over their 24-cylinder altar, but now their goal was not to tame, but to provoke. They began to practice what can only be called mechanical black magic. They increased the compression ratio. They changed the carburetor settings. They experimented with the gear ratio of the reduction box, forcing the contra-rotating props to spin even faster, biting into the air with unimaginable fury. The power of the Fiat AS.6 engine crept upwards. 2,800 horsepower, 2,900, 3,000. They stopped at the mark of 3,100, 300 extra horses torn from metal and fire. Each one was a drop of gasoline thrown onto the smoldering embers of disaster. The machine was operating on a setting that would inevitably lead to self-destruction. The only question was how long it would last. 5 minutes? 10? That should be enough. For Francesco Agello, this meant returning to the same torture chamber, now heated even hotter. He had already tamed this beast. Now he had to ride its enraged, dying twin brother. Agello knew. The upgraded engine was a one-way ticket, either to the record books or to the bottom of Lake Garda with his predecessors. He spent hours studying telemetry from the test stands. He listened to the engine's roar, trying to catch new, fatal notes in its voice. He wasn't preparing for a flight. He was preparing for a duel, where his opponent was entropy itself. October 23rd, 1934. A cold dawn over Desenzano. The air was still and crystal clear. Perfect conditions. Perfect for dying or becoming a legend. The tension on the shore was so thick you could cut it with a knife. This was no longer a pursuit of glory. It was a sacred ritual. The final act of a great and tragic play. Agello, just as before, climbed into the cockpit of MM-181, but now his movements lacked the surgeon's calculation. There was the fatal resolve of a gladiator entering the arena. He buckled himself in again, becoming one with a machine whose heart was pushed to its pre-mortem limit. Behind him, in 24 cylinders, seethed enough power to wipe a small city block off the face of the earth. Startup. The roar that erupted from the exhaust pipes was different. Higher, more furious, with a hysterical screaming strain. This was not the sound of a working mechanism. It was the scream of metal pushed to agony. The plane shot forward, and even the water of Lake Garda seemed to part before it in terror. Liftoff. The Scarlet Demon was in the air again, but this time it was riding not on the wings of Italian pride. It was riding on the wings of pure, distilled madness. And Francesco Agello pulled the stick back, hurtling towards either immortality or a fiery abyss. First pass. Second. Agello and the Scarlet Demon were no longer pilot and plane. They had become a single vibrating organism, existing on the edge of the possible. On one run, the instrument needle touched the mark of 717 kilometers per hour. This was a speed that should not have existed for a propeller-driven machine. It was a challenge thrown in the face of the future. Third pass, fourth, and silence. The roar of the engine, pushed to agony, faded, and a ringing emptiness of anticipation took its place. The judges on the shore bent over their chronometers, double-checking their calculations. And then, a whisper spread through the crowd, which grew into a shout, and then into a roar that seemed to rival the Fiat AS.6 itself. 709.209. 709.209 kilometers per hour. The barrier had been broken. The psychological Everest had been conquered. Italy had not just reclaimed the record, it had raised it to an unattainable height. Fascist propaganda was ecstatic. This was not just a triumph of technology. It was proof of the superiority of spirit, of a nation, of will. The Macchi MC-72 had finally transformed from a killing machine into an icon. But when the roar of the engine fell silent and the ink on the newspaper headlines dried, it was time to ask the uncomfortable questions. What next? What was the price of this deafening triumph? On one hand, immortality. Decades passed. Humanity entered the jet age, broke the sound barrier, went into space. But that October record remained eternal. No piston-engine seaplane in history ever flew that fast again. The number 709-209, torn from roaring metal, was frozen in the amber of time. It became a monument to an era when engineers were poets and pilots were gladiators, a solitary, unsurpassed peak in aviation history. On the other hand, absolute, deafening uselessness. The price of this immortality? 34 million lire, the royal treasury, sacrificed on the altar of speed. For that money, you could have built a squadron of proper combat aircraft. You could have armed a small army. But it was all invested in 5 red machines, created for one purpose only, to fly in a straight line faster than anyone else. And this engineering masterpiece turned out to be a technological dead end. It did not become the progenitor of a new generation of fighters. It was too complex, too expensive, too dangerous. It required perfect conditions, like a capricious opera diva, and could only perform a single aria. The war that was already on Europe's doorstep demanded not exquisite sprinters, but durable and versatile fighters. The MC-72 was a magnificent evolutionary dead end, a beautiful but sterile branch on the tree of aviation, and the fates of this legend's creators were fitting for their creation, great and tragic. Francesco Agello, the man who looked death in the eye twice in a superheated cockpit and emerged victorious both times, did not meet his end in the embrace of his scarlet demon. The war his record had foreshadowed caught up with him in 1942. He died testing a production Macchi C-202 fighter, a common workhorse of the war. He had tamed the fiercest beast in the sky, only to fall victim to the routine brutality of his time. And the plane itself? The record holder, MM-181, outlived its pilot. It survived the war. It survived the very era for which it was created. Today, it stands in the silence of the Air Force Museum at Vigna di Valle. Deprived of its fiery heart, its alchemical blood, it is frozen like a prehistoric insect in amber. Thousands of tourists walk past, admiring its predatory, perfect lines, but they only see a scarlet sculpture. They do not hear the death scream of its engine. They do not feel the heat of the scalding oil that enveloped the pilot. They do not see the ghosts that still live at the bottom of Lake Garda. It is silent, immortal, and useless. And this silent icon, this monument to incredible human obsession, still asks us the same question. Was it the pinnacle of creation, or simply the fastest and most expensive monument to vanity in history? We have witnessed a story not about an airplane, but about human obsession, about how will, multiplied by genius, gives birth to a mechanical god that demands its creators and common sense as sacrifices. It is a tale of a summit, reached only to discover that it leads nowhere. And looking at this frozen scarlet silhouette, it is worth asking ourselves, what is truly more valuable, the summit itself, or the path we forge to reach it? And where is the line beyond which the greatest triumph of engineering thought becomes merely a monument to our own vanity? Was this scarlet demon the pinnacle of creation, or a brilliant mistake? We await your thoughts in the comments, for it is in this dialogue that truth is born. If you, like us, value these stories from the edge of the possible, Please support us. Your subscription and like are the fuel for our future flights deep into history.